think we will get started. So I'd like to just first say welcome to everybody. Thanks for being here tonight for our lecture on good housing for young children and caregivers. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to our wonderful chair and panel, but I just quickly want to give a little context about what this event is and why we're here. My name is Katie Beck, and I work at LSE Cities with a dedicated team on a program called the Urban95 Academy, which is offered to urban leaders who want to gain the tools to make their cities more child-friendly and more care-centered. So our program is in its third year, and so far we've reached over 900 urban leaders from over 260 municipalities around the world. And it's a collaboration with the Leer Foundation, represented here tonight by Victoria Chavez and Andrea Torres. So we want to thank you very much for your continued support and dedication and support for this program. So we're currently in the middle of our 7th cohort of the program, and we're joined tonight by representatives of 10 cities who are working really hard this week. So thank you all so much for being here. And we're also joined online by a number of our alumni. So thank you all for joining us as well. And hopefully we'll hear from you later on when we have some questions. So now I'd like to turn over to our chair for this evening's event. We're very happy to welcome Dr. David Madden, who is an associate professor in sociology and the director of the Cities program here at the LSE. David's work focuses on urban studies, housing, political sociology, and social theory. And David is also an author. The second edition of his book, In Defense of Housing, has just been published. Before I turn over, I just want to also remind everyone our event is being simultaneously translated into a number of languages. So I probably should have reminded myself to try to speak slowly so our interpreters have a chance to catch up. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight and to share this program. The concept of good housing is never a neutral concept. And so I'm glad that we are going to have some space to debate it here tonight. Housing is always good for some people, for some uses, in some contexts, and it may not be good for others. Housing that's designed for single people in their 20s might not be good for large families. Housing that caters to high net worth individuals might not be good for working class households. And housing that's optimized for landlords might not be good for the renters who live in it. You can tell who's prioritized by urban politics by looking at whose version of good housing and the good city actually gets built and maintained. So the purpose of our discussion tonight is to ask what happens when we look at good housing and the social and urban contexts within which housing is embedded from a perspective that puts children and their carers at the center of the story. What we can call the children's housing question is increasingly urgent. In many big cities, urban life and the residential experience is increasingly precarious for children, as we know that it is for adults. This is due to a litany of social and political factors, which we can discuss, that are often known as the housing crisis, the broader cost of living crisis, decades of austerity-driven social cuts, the downloading of responsibility for social reproduction and care onto resource-strained households themselves, and extreme, rapidly growing inequality. London might be home to some of the richest families in the world, but it also has the highest rate of child poverty in the UK. So according to the Childhood Trust, more than 1/3 of children living in London households live in poverty, which is an astonishing and shameful statistic. More than 1/3 of children in London are living in poverty. This population is very unevenly distributed by tenure type. So in owner-occupied housing, 13% of children are living in poverty, but 42% of impoverished children live in the private rental sector, which is up significantly from 17% 20 years ago. So this is a massive increase in child poverty in the private rental sector. Children in the UK face significant housing precarity. Across England, nearly 146,000 children are homeless and living in temporary accommodation. More than 2 million children in England live in overcrowded housing, with households of color 3 times as likely to experience overcrowding as white households. And overcrowding has many different facets and scales. There are more than 310,000 children in England who are forced to share beds with other family members. According to Shelter England, 172 private renting households with children are issued with no-fault eviction notices every single day. So when we talk about children's housing, we need to talk about housing security and tenants' rights, as well as design. And it's not just impoverishment and insecurity that shape children's housing in London. It's also a question of the social infrastructure which children can access through their housing and communities. So 31% of London children do not have access to play space near their housing. And more than 60% of children do not have adequate outdoor space at their school either. Across London, there are extreme shortages of facilities both for early years childcare and after-school childcare. Since 2011, more than 40% of youth centres in London have been cut. And many London boroughs, including Hackney, Lambeth, Islington, and Camden, are closing schools due to falling birth rates and the displacement of households with children. So I think overall, it's very clear today that children's needs in terms of housing and communities are not being met in London and across the UK. And the harm that children face as a result of housing injustice will reverberate for decades. So we're here tonight to ask what isn't, I think we can now see, an incredibly important question. What would housing and the housing system more broadly look like if children's and carers' needs were being met? How would things have to be different? What would have to change in terms of design, in terms of policy? So I look forward to hearing some creative solutions and responses to this. So to that end, let me briefly introduce our panel. Our first speaker, Dinah Bornat, is an architect, urban designer, and researcher, and director of ZCD Architects, a leading expert in child-friendly cities. She's published numerous pieces of research and served as an advisor to government at many levels. She's a former Quality of Life Foundation associate, former design council expert, and mayor's design advocate for the Mayor of London, and she chaired the GLA's Making London Child-Friendly research. We're also going to hear from Joe McCafferty, who is an architect and has been a director at Levitt Bernstein since 2006. Joe sits on design review panels for Lewisham, Hackney, and Newham. She is co-author of the Housing Design Handbook, which was published in 2018. And she's given evidence to numerous select committees and served as chair of New London Architecture's expert panel on housing since 2020. We're also going to hear from Jacob Wilson, who's head of design at Guinness Partnership, one of the UK's largest affordable housing providers. Jacob was head of design at Be First and has also had professional roles at Arup, Hackney Council, and the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. Jacob also serves as vice chair of Tower Hamlets' design review panel. So I want to welcome all of our panelists tonight. Let me just quickly outline how this event will work. First, we're going to hear from Dinah, and I think in the process, also watch a clip from a film that Joe produced. Then we'll have a discussion with the rest of our panelists, after which we will have time for questions from the in-person and online audiences. So I want to thank you all again for coming, and now turn things over to Dinah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. Okay, this one, right? Yeah. Ah, fantastic. Thank you very much. What a great introduction. And I'd love to take hold of all of those statistics that you brilliantly presented as what the very difficult challenge that we face. I'm going to tell you a bit about our practice and the work that we've done. And I'm going to start with a photograph here of a project that we're working on. This is taken in the Olympic Park with a group of people who are made of local people from West London, from Earls Court, and 6 of the 15 of them are children. They are under the age of 18. So we've created an intergenerational panel of people to help us design a new big piece of city in West London. on the site of a former exhibition centre in Earls Court. It's, I think, maybe one of the only of its kind in the world where we have included children in the conversation. And that's because the work that we do in our practice for the last 10 years has been really focused on children's needs, particularly around housing. So I'm really grateful, David, for your statistics to kind of frame what the problem is. I'm going to come up with just a few, keeping it very simple, ideas and ways of thinking that any of you from the Urban95 cohort and elsewhere can hopefully take with you, because they're kind of common to all of us. Indeed, we all are familiar with the idea of housing. This is a photograph from some work that we've been doing with Leer Foundation. I don't think, no, not Vicky and Andrea aren't in this photograph, but they have been part of this project where we've been working with families in the UK and Ireland and the US to find out a bit more about not the older children that I showed you in the last photograph, but the very young children, the ones under 5. So we are here with some families and their children. And then because of our relationship with Earls Court, we've been able to bring them in as well and start working with a group of parents there too. So one of the 5 groups that we worked with. So that means that going forward, we've now got a new relationship where we can kind of build the foundations for, we hope, a really child-friendly focused approach to planning and delivering a new piece of city. So starting at 0, going all the way up to 18. In fact, the group that we've been working with, that 15, one of the children was 14 when she started, and I think before the sleep year turns out, she will be 18. So that just shows how long it takes to build a piece of city, and we haven't even got planning permission yet. So why focus on children? I think David's statistics were really helpful, but one other element that I often refer to, and I hope my statistics are right because I'm in the LSE, is 35%. I think that 35% of the population is either a child or the single caregiver in the kind of proportion of the birth rate in this country. So it's every child plus one adult divided by the UK's birth rate, which is 1.49 at the moment. But that, whichever way you look at it, is a significant minority of the population who will be thinking about the needs of their child or be a child themselves. Now, we don't focus on this group when we plan. We don't focus on them because they're usually concerned with childcare. They're usually not able to come to the sessions where we might be talking about new housing in their area. So we really don't take the time to think about what their needs are, but they are the biggest group. And if you look at this young chap here, they will be living in the housing for the longest. So we really do, as well as what you were saying there, we need to be thinking about them. They spend a lot of time at home. They spend a lot of time at home and around their local neighbourhoods, and that doesn't change right the way through being a child. So it's really critical to get their housing design layout right for them. So many of you might be urban planners, but you might not be, and you might be wondering why you should be thinking about these things. Well, when we do invest in new housing or add to existing housing, we are spending a huge amount of capital, and we need to be getting it right. So anything that you might be doing that's intersecting with housing, any way of thinking about it, don't forget that these are major projects, and I think there's a real need for all the thinking to just broaden out beyond just architecture and planning. So this is a photograph of what we might call high density housing. This is a project that Jacob might be able to talk about in Barking and Dagenham, which is an outer London suburb where we're building many more homes where there's a very high demand. And you can see the housing here framing a new local park. Excuse me. It might also mean houses, what we might call low density housing. This is a project in Birmingham, which is in the Midlands area of England. And we can see a shared garden here and a group of residents. And I've been lucky enough to interview one of them for a book that I've written about housing and children. I just want to put some more statistics up here. This is from our practice and the work we've been doing over the last 10 years, where we've built a really large body of research looking, as I say, specifically at housing and designing for children. Some of the work has been really pure research using observational techniques. We have been looking at where children spend time outside their homes. And we've also deliberately balanced this with conversations with children and young adults and older people and their parents and carers. So this has added up to what we've now calculated, thanks to Nick over there from our office, to hundreds of sessions. And now incredibly looks like, I think, nearly 1,000 people that we've worked with. So with all this work, Jo, who's been a fantastic supporter of our work over the years, suggested that we should write a book. And she said, it will write itself, Dinah. I don't think it did write itself. But one of the things, let me just get my slides right. It did do is it took us to lots of different countries, and what we found was the same thing in many countries. We looked at the same questions of spaces where residents use and the issues of what made good housing for children, and that this is one of the really interesting and important insights. I'm going to keep it very simple. Children do play out. It hasn't been completely lost. They do that because they need to play out. It's a developmental stage, and they get a huge amount of joy from it. It's a very natural and very essential part of child development, and older children need to do it too. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, children want to play, and they will do it when they can. And you'll find this in all sorts of different places. But one thing I'd like you to do is I'd like to urge you to look for the conditions that allow children to play, because that's what's the basis of a really good childhood. And these photographs show this, taken by my great friend, the photographer Madeline Waller, on an estate in Hackney, near where I live. They want to play outside with friends, and they play like this in this kind of what we call doorstep play. So this house here opens onto a space where there are no cars, and these children can just come straight out of their front door and they can play with their friends, and their parent can call from the window. This is essential conditions for children to play. It's quite easy to do in lower density, but we need to move the car out of the way. Now, how do we make this real? As architects and urban planners, we need to bring some science into it. So we've started over the last 10 years looking at how we might map for this. And this is a map that we use, a heat map that we use, that I'm not going to explain in great detail. It is in the book. And it takes 4 things into account: whether a space is overlooked, car-free, directly accessible from a home, and connected to another space. This is the same estate. Those 4 red spaces, those warmer spaces, are where the children play out, and they will play out from when they're 2 years old. Basically, as soon as they can move, they want to be outside with their friends. So this is one of our schemes from the practice. One of the schemes we're really proud of, where we set out to make sure that children could play, and this is a perfect place for families. It's a housing scheme in the countryside, and from the layout of the interior of the home, where all the rooms are sited, and the relationship with the garden and the shared garden, we thought really carefully about sight lines and privacy, so that we could get the same condition to happen, where children could just spill outside, and they do, and play for hours on end, as you can see what one of the residents telling us. It's the same wherever you go in the world, as I said. Yes, in Holland, in Denmark, in the US, Canada, Spain, all the places that I visited for the book. Here in the UK at Marmalade Lane, I'm just giving you 2-second heads up for the film. And I want to, these photographs are fantastic, and they really show what we're talking about. But I'm going to show you this excerpt from the film that Jo has made with her friends Rachel and Anna, who Jo was a resident on the Highgate Newtown estate, and I think it brings to life beautifully what we're trying to talk about. Do I need to unmute the speaker? Is that right? Okay. Lovely film. It's about 20 minutes long, the whole film, isn't it? And it's absolutely gorgeous. And I think we've compressed quite a lot of the child-friendly stuff in there, but you will have noticed the doorstep play and the different types in the football and how children were using the spaces in the way that they do to play and to be incredibly social. So it's really what we're talking about here is the kind of glue that holds communities together. This is the essential thing we should be thinking about. And I think for all of us, whether or not we're architects or urban planners, we can kind of recognise what that means. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing with Van Leer. And one more really important learning, which I just want to add into this idea of doorstep play. So this project we've been working on is to create a toolkit, which will really soon launch. And it's but the production of it has allowed us to work really closely with parents of very young children. And one of the very important findings that we had that I'd like to share with you came from the time that we spent together with all of the groups. And that, perhaps not surprisingly, you know that you find that how hard it is to bring up children. It's hard work. We all know this. I mean, I've got 3 of my own, and I know how much work it is when they're smaller. But it's not just hard work. It can be very isolating, especially if you're a single parent, but actually for any parent really of a small child in the city or not. This idea of isolation should be a real concern to all of us, and we should be thinking of how we can do something about it. So as well as providing good facilities, we need to be designing places where this kind of activity can happen, where parents can meet and chat and children can play. But car-centred development doesn't allow that to happen. It doesn't focus on the spaces for people where this kind of encounter can happen on the same estate that I showed you earlier, where parents can chat for the first time, children can play, and people can get to know each other. So we need to make these spaces. This I wasn't lucky enough to bring my children up on that estate, but we did live on a street nearby, or we still do. And this is a photograph of when we closed the street to cars and it became a play street. So this is where parents get a chance to meet. This is where children get to play outside. And I'm just going to end with one more example of how we can take this knowledge to a larger scale. Because what we do in our practice is that we want to combine this kind of engagement work that we're doing with Van Leer and others with really hard-nosed strategic planning and really unlock the way we plan communities. And to do that, I think we really need to include children in the work that we do. This is a neighbourhood that in East London, in Poplar, and I worked with Joe and a big team on planning a large neighbourhood. And we worked with children from local schools, secondary schools and primary schools. And they gave us really, really insightful information about how the area was laid out and how they use it. And we were really able to influence the planning of hundreds of new homes and spaces, and worked really, really hard to create more doorstep space, better connections between spaces, and improve spaces where parents could meet. And we planned again with that same heat map, whole neighbourhoods, and showed how they could change as the development was delivered. So you can use the same principles on a larger scale and at a very strategic level. I'm just going to go back to that group that I introduced at the beginning in Earls Court. They're sitting here in the Olympic Park. I'm really convinced that by having children in the conversation about making them part of the planning from strategic to detailed thinking, we can actually start to think about really good intergenerational communities. And I'm going to finish with a slide of the book. And why I invited Joe and Jacob to join in the conversation, because they both helped me with the book and helped me with some of the schemes, and Joe's contributed one of the chapters about Highgate Newtown. It's going to be published very soon, and it's going to be, I hope, the point at which we finally place children of all ages and their very important lives centre stage when we start to plan housing. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dinah. That was extremely interesting and informative. Maybe we can just start with Joe and Jacob, if either of you want to just speak a bit either to what Dinah was just saying, or to this sort of broad question of how our picture of good housing needs to be adjusted to take into account the needs of children and carers.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I think just in terms of response to what Dinah's just shown, I think it's great to see this book. I think it's great to see this research. I personally don't think there is enough research into how children use housing, especially in relation to developing new housing, new estates, new neighbourhoods. As Dinah said, one of the pictures that was shown was the Gascoigne estate in Barking and Dagenham, which is East London, and where I worked a lot and was responsible for delivering several of the buildings there. And you know, we worked really hard with children, but I think that is a rarity within UK development. But we worked really hard with kids in local schools, in community centres, to bring them into that process and learn really valuable insights. And from doing it, so we did. Worked with White Architecture and did a programme called Places for Girls. And that was really driven by the fact that we were aware that the majority of the public spaces in that estate weren't being used by girls, but 80% of the users of that space was boys or young men. So we really wanted to kind of work hard on what are the design criteria for bringing more people into the spaces. It's quite interesting because it was a 1970s estate. There was a lot of fragmented little spaces which weren't overlooked. And I think it draws on Dinah's research. You know, it's really about getting bigger spaces and you know, it's multi-generational, but also integrating it with these communal spaces and also spaces. So I think it really ties into a lot of the research that Dinah's been doing.
I think I'd sort of add to that, Jacob. So completely agree, and I know that that's your kind of experience working at Be First. And I think what Jacob is too modest to talk about, but one of the reasons it worked at Be First, I think, so well was that the planning team and development team in the borough were joined and part of the same group of people that were looking at development. And so the conversation about policy and some of the conflict in housing policy, which is a real challenge now, all sorts of aspects, particularly when you're developing a high density and you're trying to achieve aspects of play, aspects of greening and open space, and a lot of homes all on one site. But have a planning team working with you and understanding those challenges, looking at it in that kind of real way, what's happening really on the ground now with young people, was really rare. And quite often, I mean, I think in this country particularly, I think of that child's game where you whisper something in someone's ear and they then whisper it to their neighbour and then whisper it to their neighbour, and then after about 10 whispers you hear what's said at the end. And that's like housing delivery in this country, because essentially we find ourselves in a position of not the people at the beginning of that process not being there at the end, or even in the middle, or even in the second whisper. And so how on earth can you control and ensure that conversations that you're having with children and young people are delivered at the end if all of those people have disappeared through the process? So I think there's something fractured and problematic in the way we work and the way we deliver housing, certainly in the UK and in England particularly, where those conversations all the time, you need people like Dinah at the table kind of saying, remember this was said at this particular stage, to ensure that it gets delivered.
Well, how do you think, I think it's interesting that you're both talking about the process of housing delivery, and that partly it's a matter of incorporating other perspectives, children's perspectives, carers' perspectives into the process of delivering housing. And also trying to connect housing departments and planning departments. I mean, what are some sort of procedural or processual or even bureaucratic changes you think would sort of enable housing to focus on children's needs in a clearer way?
Well, I think I'm going to dive in there, but I think that number one, we need to change that process of those that are commissioned, the changes in the commissioning and the housing commissions at the beginning, the planners, the design teams shifting so much through the process. That just can't continue, and that needs to be kind of embedded in the process. I think it's really important that obviously policy supports that child's voice and young person's voice. And that Dinah's done a lot of work in analysing the MPPF, which is a sort of national planning framework in this country that we all have to work to, where the child's voice is still really lacking. And then work, within the city in terms of the policy that guides us is the London Plan, and to try to get the young person's and child's voice into that. So there's kind of big policy changes necessary, or kind of the increasing, kind of dialing up the child's voice. I think when we're talking about projects in a situation with a planning team at those early stages and all the way through, somebody on the planning side needs to be saying, so how does this work for children and young people? That needs to be a key question that is always asked at every pre-application meeting, at every design review panel. How many children might use this space? All of those sorts of questions need to be kind of fused into the process so that it's really high in people's minds.
Can I just come in there on the planning bit? Because I think it's really interesting what we expect planning to do, particularly in this country. So UK has quite a unique planning system, and housing delivery is very much market led. And planning system is actually, largely to stop the worst development coming through. It's largely a kind of protectionism from the worst kind of development. London is slightly different. We have a lot more kind of proactive guidance, but nationally it's that kind of defence. And I think what's really important, I imagine with a lot of the developments that Dinah are looking at, is actually to have that enlightened client, to have that enlightened developer. That's what's going to really make a difference. Policy can do one thing, but often actually becomes a tick box exercise. It can become a tick box exercise. I predict I'm going to have this many children from this development, so I need to deliver this quantum of space. That dominates the conversation, or a lot of meetings I see, that dominates the conversation. Not what's the quality of that space, or looking more holistically, how does the whole development cater for children? It's what is that number for that space, because it's protecting from the minimum. And I think we need to move away from that. We need to move away to a more kind of, how is the client driving this? How is it commissioning design teams which will really push this agenda? And that takes a shift away. And I think, we need more local authorities to deliver housing, because often they've got more, they're a lot more interested in what that place will be like. They take that long-term view. Or we need more community builders or small SME builders who will take that long-term view of like, what is this place going to be like to really drive forward that agenda.
I mean, I agree with everything you guys have said, and I think sometimes the policy can be incredibly dry, and actually I think one of the problems that we have, and probably have everywhere in any sector, is that it kind of reflects our attitude towards children as a society. So, like, we need to ask ourselves some really basic questions, like, what is the outcome we want for this for our cities? Do we want children to be able to be outside as much as they want? We've always had a problem with children playing. This is not a new thing. We've had a problem with ball games. We've had a problem with teenagers. And there's a kind of criminalizing of teenagers. And I think, in my lifetime, we've kind of increased the age of childhood, if you like, till the age of 18 now. So children are protected up to that age group. They are safeguarded. They are kept in education. But I think even in my actual lifetime, that age has risen from 14 up to about 18, probably. So they used to go to work when they were about 14. They haven't really caught up with this idea that we are looking after people up to the age of 18 in a good way, that they need to experience some joy. They need to be able to meet their friends. They need to be able to do the things that teenagers do. And we need to talk about the challenges of kicking the ball against the wall. Teenagers hanging out in groups, which is another developmental stage, which is incredibly important for them. And I think we need to talk about it in society. Schools are doing what schools do. And the minute they leave school, they're kind of in their local neighbourhood. And so it's more time, I think, outside school and not sleeping than any other time. Like, do you know what I mean? That's the greatest amount of time you're going to spend as a child. Huge amount of time between 3:30 and going to bed. And we know, I think, as a society, that we don't really want them on screens. We talk about this a lot, and we talk a lot about how to get them off screens and how we need to get, you know, the companies, social media to do something about it. But when you talk to them about it, they're like, no, we'd much rather be outside playing with our friends than on screens. We never ask them that question. We never provide for that setting. So we never really properly think about childhood in that respect. And so suddenly, when you look at it from that perspective, us as architects and developers and designers have potentially got the biggest challenge, haven't we? Because we've got the most amount of time, and it turns out they really want to be outside playing. And so perhaps all eyes should be on us, and we should be providing this great childhood, because from a selfish perspective, happy children are going to lead to happy adults and productive adults who are going to look after me in my old age. I can't think of any other way to say it, but like, it's not clever to design unhappy childhoods into our built environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, do you think that part of the issue is what we consider to be good housing in this country? I mean, I think it's striking that the examples that we're all citing are examples taken from what had been one of the most stigmatized housing forms around, which is the 1970s council estate. And we now see that the provision of shared spaces, the provision of community infrastructure that was there on the best examples of them, are really necessary for creating the sorts of childhoods that and housing conditions that we're talking about. But if you speak to people and sort of read the press in the UK, you get a sense that there's sort of two forms of ideal housing people have in their mind: either single family homes, or high density housing without any of the sort of communal facilities. So do you think that partly it's a matter of adjusting what is considered good practice, and also sort of revisiting some of these unjustly stigmatized forms from the past?
I would definitely say so. Obviously, I spent quite a long time making the film to try and say that exact thing. But I think it's what's really interesting about it. We've been showing the film. I hope everyone can watch it after this, because it's 24 minutes long. So there's a lot more in there about the sort of context in which Highgate Newtown was built. But we've been showing the film to housing commissioners, local authorities, Camden themselves, because it's situated in Camden, but lots of local authority development and planning teams. And it's having quite a big impact. And what's really interesting is that I know that if we talked about the architectural aspects of Highgate Newtown, everybody would have said in those teams, we can't possibly build that again. But one, because I wasn't saying it, it was being said by people who live there. And the question we asked everybody in making the film was just, it was very open-ended. It was just, what do you love about living here? And that kind of completely unlocks a conversation about architectural aspects. And it was spoken about in architectural ways. People talk about light and space and flexibility and connection to outside and view and threshold. All of those things that are all the things that we're talking about in housing all the time as architects and designers. So I think it's really interesting. I think there's real value in going back to that time and going back to older housing. I reflected as a practitioner that when we're working on projects and designing new housing and working particularly on regeneration projects where we're talking to communities and inviting residents to come and see other things we've built, we only talk and show housing estates that are maybe 5-10 years old. And on occasion we introduce them to groups of residents, but we never go back to estates which have been lived in for 50 years and talk about the success of that and how we might achieve some of those elements that foster that sense of community and playing out in new development. We never do that. Why is that? I mean, it's insane. So I think absolutely, I think we need to look back to then look forward and think about what really fosters good housing. The other point that I just wanted to come to is your sort of, you know, what does good housing look like? I think one of the real problems particularly in the UK, you know, you were describing at the beginning all the statistics about the private rented sector and all sorts of different aspects and different parts of the housing model in this country. And part of the problem is that we're designing housing now for very, very specific needs and groups of people with different standards. And actually, we should be designing good housing for everybody that's flexible, that can change for households over time, so people can stay when households shrink, you know, that works for kind of multi-generations. And that's still structurally, that isn't happening in this country at all.
Yeah, I think your point on looking back is really, really interesting. Because I mean, we've both worked on a lot of 1970s, 1960s estates, which a lot of people would say have failed. I think, Dinah, the ones that you showed are often the kind of best examples of that era. But it's interesting, you know, those estates, the layouts, especially the communal spaces, were a response to development of the cars and roads and creating spaces away from that, because the architects realised that communal space is so important to foster community. And I think because there were some, you know, failures around those estates, you know, in the 80s, we almost jumped to the opposite direction. Everything was private, you know, private corridors, private rear gardens, private front gardens, you know, none of that communal space. And I think now is the time where we are starting to see a change. And it's not, you know, I think there were lessons from the 70s, okay, what did go wrong? The communal space was important, let's not lose that. But there are lessons about how we can make it work better, whether that's the active frontages, you know, the how you circulate around these buildings and around the public space. So I think we are moving back to it. You know, I think we are looking at those buildings and learning from them. Now this week I was looking at master plan, which had actually learned really interesting lessons from a development in Germany called the Ban, where actually all the car parking is on the edge of this new town. You can drive around it, but I think you can only drive around it for 1 or 2 hours if you need to drop something off. And what that means is all the streets there are for kids. They all play out on the street. So it doesn't matter about the play calculations for the designated parks, because basically everyone's playing in the streets. You see with the chalk on the road, the bikes on the street, everything that we love. And, you know, I've started to see some developments like that come into the UK. I was looking at one this week, which I think is a really exciting development about learning about how we have those communal spaces.
And you just mentioned an interesting example. I'm wondering if Joe or Dinah, if you can think of other, I don't know, sort of innovative or far-reaching ideas that would transform housing for children in CARES. I mean, I've visited co-housing developments in Canada and in Austria, and the sort of relationship between private and public space in these developments, I think really does create a different sort of experience for children. Can you think of some other examples that maybe people should look to for new ways of designing this?
There's 10 of them in the book.
What are some of your favorite ones?
Well, I mean, we need to talk about the park. We've mentioned it, haven't we? And actually maybe also just to talk a little bit about the way the planning system works in this country, which is, you know, it's very market driven, but it's also very kind of highly democratic in as much as democracy is whoever chooses to sort of take part, and actually potentially could be children, but really I'm not sure if it's not really the same in every country, but just bear with me for a moment. A development site might be taken forward by a private company, a developer, and it will be their responsibility to submit that scheme for planning. And in doing so, they hold a lot of risk in terms of objections in the local area where at that point when they submit it for planning, local residents can, if they're unhappy, really, you know, cause some issues. Now, whether or not that's the right way to deal with development in terms of democracy, it's what we have, and it means that if those people are, and they do tend to be, of a certain type who are able to engage, and potentially homeowners and car drivers, then you get a very skewed attitude towards how to deal with the public spaces. And we need to do something about that conversation because it becomes very binary, because the councillors who are elected and also making the decisions about those planning developments are elected by those same people. And so they will often be primarily concerned with cars. And we, as architects and urban planners and designers, will be thinking about the cars, and we will also be thinking about the service vehicles and the bin lorries. And we also need to be told by the people who remove the waste that they won't take 3 turns on that estate, only 1, and therefore we need to be able to drive all the way through it. So you hit a problem really, really early on, which is the movement of vehicles around the space. And then when you start to add in the fact that cars kill children and parents are not being irrational, not letting their children play outside, and cars are getting bigger, we're not really dealing with the right kind of facts and reality. We are presenting it kind of, it's almost a fait accompli. We kind of can't get it off the starting blocks. It was interesting on the pilot project that we worked in, and sorry not to give you a precedent, but we were talking to the parents and they were describing a courtyard development, and all of the projects in the book are degrees of perimeter blocks with courtyards in. So that would be my, you know, what different types of those where the courtyard is on the ground floor is the kind of very best. And one of them was remembering that she used to live in a courtyard development, and she said that she could leave her 4-year-old and go to the shops, which was great because she could get some peace and quiet while shopping and do the shopping at the same time. So sort of multitasking. We have high expectations when we're young children. But she didn't live like that anymore. She lived on a more traditional street where it was house, car, street, green space. And there was quite a lot of green space, but there was a car and a road in between the green space and her house. And I asked them, would you rather have the child in front of your house or the car? And I hadn't finished the sentence before they said the child. But they hadn't been presented with that as an option. The option was, this is the house. The living room faces the car. The kitchen's at the back, so you can't be making a meal and looking out for your kids. But they'll be in the back garden playing, but kids don't play in back gardens. Back gardens are boring. They don't have any other children in them. So we've got to stop thinking about that traditional street layout as being the right model. And yet the house builders, I think, have got a very formulaic approach, which and concerns around the kind of level of risk. I think you said earlier, Jacob, that we're sort of doing the sort of least worst, aren't we? And unfortunately, that's what we get all the time. Maybe they'll say there's a park 15 minutes away, but who's going to let their 8-year-old out to the park when it's 15 minutes away?
It's so right, Dinah. I mean, I think you mentioned Marmalade Lane earlier in Cambridge. For those that kind of, I'm sure, know that highly publicised scheme, a co-housing project, which is designed so carefully by moral architects, and with a collection of people that are invested in being part of that community. And it's well published and it's in the book, but it's relatively small scale. And I think the challenge is how we do that at higher density, how we achieve that at higher density for larger scale development. I know I'm bound to say this, but we've got a project on site at the moment in Haringey, so North London, and through the heart of that, it's 100% social housing for the local authority. And through the heart of it, we've designed a play street that is faced onto by family housing, that has no boundaries between dwellings externally. It has no railings outside front doors, and it all flows into that route, and it connects another community to the north to a huge park in the south that they currently have to walk around on car-driven streets to get to. And the fight we had to achieve that one moment, that one route, which wasn't, kind of dominated by cars and access and even simple things. So that's what I wanted to come to actually, was that I think Dinah's presentation was really great in showing that it's the big, but it's also the small that really matters here, and the small scale, and certainly there, just not having boundaries between fences, between front doors, and then the shared space that sits in front is a huge, you know, unlocks huge aspects of kind of sociability and the possibility that a parent can look out and see where their kids are and feel relaxed about it, and then meet a neighbour. All of those kind of the subtleties of those thresholds kind of hard won in housing at the moment, and they shouldn't be. That should be our starting point, not our ending point.
But it is a contested space, and I think, you know, I live in a borough in East London, and you know, the previous administration was calming the street for children, for sustainability, you know, and that is starting to be reversed. That's a political decision. So this is a contested area, you know. I think it's a good question, you know, what do you want in terms of outside your front door? Is it a car or your child's child playing?
Yeah.
That is a live political issue, and I think where I worked previously at Be First, we on the Gascoigne neighbourhood, we have a road that goes down the middle, which is very much car dominated, and we are in the process of downgrading that road, and that's to take the car journeys off. And we were looking at how people travel to school. So I think in London, 30% of morning school trips are trips to the school, so very local trips, which is just congesting the streets, which means that children are less likely to go outside. It's this kind of reinforcing issue. So we were really working hard to downgrade the road, and that meant, you know, like introducing play streets alongside the road, setbacks, so that would say connecting neighbourhoods, new houses to these community assets, whether it's the school, the community centre or the shop, and really thinking about those journeys and how we can really encourage and nudge families to move out of the car and walk and cycle to those areas, which means that they're more likely to then enjoy those parks and feel safe in those parks.
Do you think housing tenure plays a role here as well? I mean, I think that for housing that's going to be sold individually, it's a much harder case to make to not have fences and railings, but in some ways you can have much better urban practice with collective housing.
I'm not completely convinced that this idea that the private housing is often used, isn't it, in design review, that the private sale won't take this, and they're kind of describing, they talk about young professionals, and I'm like, they're gonna have kids, right? They describe this kind of pretend person, I think, who doesn't like children, and I think it goes back to our issue in society and our attitude towards children. And I think you're right, Jacob, it's a tricky one, because we've basically got a whole load of, you know, we've got assets now. Housing has become an asset rather than a right, and people are worried about their asset, and we pit that against children as being a kind of potential drain, and it is massively political. And so we kind of let the market choose something that's really kind of quite invented, I think, because when you look around, you can see images of places being sold, and they often have children playing outside, because actually, and we introduce this as a question into a questionnaire about what's the most important thing when you look for new housing. A place where children play out was actually quite highly ranked, even amongst people without children. And it sort of signifies something in us, doesn't it? Oh, if children can play out, then I kind of know what that means. Or an image of a child playing suggests safety, it suggests communality. And yet we're being told all the time that, like you just said there, the private owner's not going to like that. And I think that's not necessarily true. And I think we haven't properly sort of it's a challenge, but it's, yeah.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but I think a lot of developers don't get that. I think
Yeah.
the enlightened ones do, and they see the value of that, and actually the value that it can bring to those homes. Because
Yeah.
people do want to settle there. They do want a place that's safe for their kids. I know, Dinah, that you're going on a walk with many people here around King's Cross tomorrow,
Yeah.
and I always, you know, love the way that they have those fountains in the middle of Grosvenor Square, and just all the kids just go out and play there. It's just such a fantastic asset for the area, bringing all those kids and shit into that area. But I think it's rare, actually. I think many developers don't have the evidence maybe to think that this will, you know, sell the houses, sell the flats, drive value.
But I think that's what it's about. I think it is about the evidence, isn't it? Because I think we've all worked on projects where, you know, there is, particularly when times are hard, innovation is difficult. Doing something where anyone worries they won't be able to sell a home is difficult. yeah, you know, the Port Loop scheme, where Dinah's on Dinah's slide, the image of all the parents standing around in that kind of shared space in a scheme in Birmingham. That was 100%, I think, other than 2 dwellings, was 100% outright sale, and there were no boundaries into that space whatsoever, and lots of young families and
couples without children.
yes, all loving the fact that they could use that central space really easily, and it was directly connected to their home.
Great. Let's open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? Maybe we'll take 2 questions at a time just to maximize the number of questions that people ask. Does anyone have anything they want to ask you? So there was a hand there.
Hi, so I was wondering, as a young person myself, obviously, like you've all mentioned programs where you've reached out to young people and like getting their opinion on development. But I was wondering how we would reach out to you, because obviously I feel like we're quite underrepresented in like the council, and when speaking to MPs, you see that there's like a big participation gap between like older people and young people. And so I was wondering, like, what would you recommend for a young person who's trying to learn more about this? Because we don't really learn about it in school. We don't really have it from like our parents or like family. So I was wondering what you'd recommend to, like, what programs and things like that for us to learn more about it. Thank you.
Is there another question? Yes.
It was very interesting topics covered here. David, your presentation was great because it deals about child poverty, while the panelists address other concerns as well, mainly how housing should be designed for children. But also, I really liked Jacob's point about politics, because I think that's very fundamental, the fact that developers often don't quite act democratically, because we've seen many cases in which estates from the 70s that socially worked perfectly have been knocked down for developers to actually design schemes where there is segregation, pool doors and things we all know about. So, I mean, I think as architects and planners, we need to push more for a political agenda or lobby or whatever in order to change people's minds and council's mind. I mean, what is your view on that? I mean, this question is open to all the panelists.
So we had that question and the question about how young people can get involved more concretely.
Shall I answer the one about getting involved? I think that's a really, really good question. Thank you for asking that. Nobody's ever asked that before. And actually, it's a difficult one to answer, because I think you're revealing how impenetrable the planning system actually is. So like, for example, I've been sitting here thinking, well, would you write to your local council? Who on earth would you address that email to? Who would have the time and the place to talk to you about it? Would you talk to your geography teacher at school? I suppose the obvious answer is that when a new scheme is being submitted for planning, you might want to engage with it at that point. But even then, it's not very easy, and the way in which you can do that can be tricky. I think I'm going to take that question back with me, because I think it's just shown, hasn't it, how we don't have a system that's brilliant for bringing people in. There are lots of initiatives where we're reaching out to young people and including them, and you've talked about one, Jacob, and I think we are doing our best. But like, the idea that there's lots of young people out there who are really keen to get involved, I think is probably true. And actually, we ought to do something about that, and we ought to think of ways in which we can gather more information and evidence if there are keen people. So I feel like I can't answer your question, actually.
I've
Have
got a
anybody
couple,
thoughts?
yeah, a couple of thoughts on it. I think it's a really good question. I think, you know, a lot of it is about getting involved in local government. And I think often traditionally, local government can be quite dry. And it's not, you know, there's not a huge amount of representation. You know, elections for local governments are, you know, notoriously low turnout, so people aren't getting involved. I think there are a few spots of more interesting things happening. I'd say one of them is Camden Council in North London, where I know they've been doing citizens' assemblies, so inviting people to put themselves forward for citizens' assemblies, which address certain issues. I'm not sure exactly what they're doing, but you know, housing, the economy, or different things. So I think, you know, putting yourself forward for those kinds of initiatives, and hopefully we see that take hold with more local authorities. I think the other thing that the government are looking increasing at is the digital side and tech side, and actually how you can have much broader participation with young people through digital technology. I think that's in its infancy. I think there are some councils that are doing that, engaging through social media, making it a lot more visual, making it a lot more time efficient for people to participate in. But I think, you know, from what I've seen, it's in its infancy, but hopefully that will grow and make participation much easier.
I think that there absolutely. I mean, there are some initiatives. I think Dinah's right. I mean, it's a brilliant question and really worrying that we haven't got an answer. I think there are authorities, local authorities in London that are looking at but haven't yet managed to deliver, kind of bringing young people into the design review process, for example. So for example, you know, when we're tabling a planning application, a design, through the planning process, that the design review panel would include young people to appraise our plans, and that would be incredibly powerful, because at that point you would have the voice to say, and how does this work for me? How does this work for my community? But none of, as far as I know, in London, I don't think that currently exists. I think Tower Hamlets were trying to make that happen, and there are some local authorities that are really trying to bring in young people into the discussion about design. It was really interesting on the Poplar project with Dinah that we were working on, and we worked with the two local schools and a group of young people that really were really involved in shaping our master plan on that project. And there's nothing, I have to say, as a professional, there's nothing more terrifying than standing in front of 25, 30, 16-year-olds saying, what do you think of this master plan? I mean, that's really tested. But it was a really amazing process, because as a result of that, several young people in that group were all saying, I'm really interested in my role in this and my community and in design. And there was a kind of sudden moment where you could start to see that they're going to become the urban designers of our future. And that's a wonderful thing. So I think the final thing I would say is it would be wonderful if there's plenty of representation of young people in planning committees. That's a huge problem. The fact that the majority of people in this country that are deciding what gets planning approval and what doesn't are white, male, and probably over the age of 55. And most of them own a car and own their home. And that's a huge problem. Yeah.
On the second point, just on the politics, I think it's incredibly important. I think, you know, nearly everything we've covered today is political and does rest on good politics. I think I've been working for boroughs actually where there's been real kind of leadership from the politicians at a local level, which has made the biggest difference to what I can deliver at the local level. I think, you know, a couple of things. I think, you know, we need to see more transparency actually in decision making. I know that, you know, I think actually it's quite good in London, but outside of London, I think, you know, it's less good. I think there should be a lot more transparency in terms of how housing decisions are made at a political level. I think my second point is, you know, you said about architects getting involved. I think absolutely I would encourage that. I trained as an urban designer and then went to work in local authority on the development side. And there is in the UK an organisation called Public Practice. I don't know if you know it, but I would encourage you to look at it, which has, you know, created a lot of positions within local authorities for architects, urban designers, landscape architects to do placement in local authorities and offer their skills in terms of working for council. So I think that's a really good programme that's worth looking at.
Great. I see two other hands.
I was just wondering if any of your projects or research kind of touches on how child-friendly spaces or places where children can play kind of improves elderly people's well-being and specifically like targets loneliness. Because as someone who works in a care home, like nothing makes residents happier than having children playing in the care home. So yeah, this one. Thanks.
Hello. I'm interested in the contradictions of this idea of safety because I come from Chile, and when I see these gated communities advertising, basically they're showing kids and they're using this argument to really build this gated community. So I wanted to ask you, what's the importance for you of public spaces and having these projects open to the public space, because all of these cases of council estates and housing, they are basically communal spaces that are freely open to the city. So I'm like kind of interested in understanding what's your position about public space in this context.
Great. So the first question was about how child-friendly spaces might also work for seniors.
I've got an anecdotal point for the first question and a real another anecdote for the second one. I don't know enough about older people and children, although when we did our research, what the people we saw outside the most were children, significantly more than any other age group, and that dropped off quite quickly at teenage. And we didn't see older people spending extended time outside as much as children, which is probably true. What we couldn't dig into those statistics was whether old people were enjoying watching children playing, and I think that needs some interviewing. And there is one interview in the book with someone that I think we all know, who's an older person who's moved to a housing estate, and she's really enjoying overlooking the play street, and she's chosen it, and she says it's not a play street, it's a social street. And my parents are about to move to the Olympic Park, which is very child friendly because of the social element that it offers in their old age. So I think it's incredibly attractive to older people. And again, I don't think it's something that sales and the market is really thinking about. On your point about safety, I think in the UK we have kind of our own approach to it, which I don't think you can necessarily translate to other countries. And the reason I'm saying that is that when we went to Chicago, there were real issues around gun crime. And like people, there was the place where we went to work, the housing estate was absolutely lovely, but the security guard had been fatally shot there a few weeks before. So having that estate gated was really important. And that's we don't have the same level of gun crime in this country, thankfully, and so we can't just necessarily project our own ideals onto other countries where levels of crime and those sorts of issues of safety are quite different. But having said that, the kind of movement of children and the way in which they were playing outside and could get to school carefully and safely were the same issues. And I think the parents really wanted freedom for their children. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about safety, when we all, I think, everywhere want our children to kind of experience a level of freedom, and we need to frame it in that same way. I think just gating on its own to create safety is too binary and doesn't actually help all of us think about, our own childhood and the freedom that we all wanted. So I have learned a bit from going abroad that we can't just kind of put our own culture into places where issues of safety might be quite different.
It's really interesting. I've got two points really to both questions, but to your point, Dinah, just there. At Highgate Newtown, one of the successes of it is the fact that a public route from a park and a street through the estates and then to a school and a library is part of its success. So one of the reasons why that's not gated is because it's thought about as part of that part of North London. It's kind of part of the city, and it connects those things, and that connection, which means that anybody can do that cut through alongside the people that live there, and the kind of domestic life and roots and so on that happens with all ages on the estate itself, is the wonder of its success, really, is that those two things are happening in parallel, and that you can have that chance encounter with somebody that you know lives 5 streets away and not on the estate, because they happen to be passing through alongside that kind of very intense relationship that you might have with your neighbours. So I agree with Dinah. I'm just describing that particular context in that particular part of North London, and you know, in that part of England. But the other point I wanted to make about older people and children and young people, because I think it's really important we remember we are talking about young people and not just children tonight. But I think we're working on a project with Phoenix, who are a housing association, where they have this really enlightened view of kind of intergenerational living. So it's sheltered, supported housing that we're designing, but it's also very close to Goldsmiths College in Lewisham. And the wonderful thing there is that we're allowed as part of the brief, it's kind of set out as part of the brief, to be designing subsidised student housing within this older person's housing project. And the students get that subsidised accommodation if they help out in the gardens and visiting other residents in that housing. And it just feels so obvious that that's a good thing. And yes, we're talking about 20-year-olds, we're not talking about 15-year-olds, but that is a model for a housing association to be promoting that and delivering it. Actually, you know, it's just finishing next month, is a really wonderful thing. We need to be showing how, you know, how that extends the lifespan of those people, because it does. You're quite right, it does.
Yeah, just a quick point. I think on the gated community bit, I mean, I know I completely agree with you. I think, you know, in terms of looking abroad, I think I'm less confident kind of commenting on that. But I think where I worked on the Gascoigne estate, so the picture that you showed, we had Scandinavian architects working on that who were absolutely adamant that every courtyard had to be open and a democratic space, and we had endless conversations about whether they should be closed and private. We did a lot of conversation. Actually, one of the biggest issues that we had was this sense of crime in the neighbourhood, and that we had to overcome that. And actually, how we ended up was that some courtyards are open and some are closed, and I think we probably need to go back and look at it and which are the most successful. But we were very aware that some residents wanted these closed courtyards so they could have their kids safely play there while they could be in their kitchen, you know, looking on and feel confident with that they would take ownership of those courtyards if they weren't open. I think on the multi-generational thing, I think absolutely, I don't think in this country we do enough of integrating those housing blocks into our bigger developments. I think we should see a lot more of that. And maybe, you know, I imagine the use of the public realm is different, maybe it's at different times or different, you know, types of spaces that those users would use. But I think we need to see more integration into our larger housing projects.
We have a few online questions. Maybe Katie can read them to us.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So we have a question from Samira in San Diego, who actually is one of our alumni from one of our previous cohorts, and she's asking if you can share some tools, resources, and ideas for how to conduct observation studies to get a deeper understanding of children's behavior in public spaces and in outdoor spaces. I know you have lots to share on that, but I'll also just add one other question so you can consider both. So we have another question from Lisa Blythe, who says she's really enjoying the discussion and she can relate to the issues, but she says she feels that within the architecture community, this is viewed as a niche issue. Becoming a parent is often the catalyst for an increased interest in designing for children rather than anything that's in education or in advocacy. So she wants to thank you for bringing some light to this, and also asks all of the panelists, if you had a magic wand, what more would you do as a group of professionals?
Great, so tools, toolkits and magic wands.
Well, the toolkit one really quickly, again, is in the book, but I shamelessly or with great respect took Jan Gale's way of measuring use of space, which is quite simple. You stand in a space and you count how many people move through it. And he was particularly interested in how much time people spend in that space. And you basically stand there for hours and hours and hours and work out, guess the ages of the people that are in that space. And Yangel's got a particular way of kind of categorizing their use of space as being kind of passing through or social, and put some subcategories there. And it's really quite simple. And it's actually one of the ways we kind of entered into this piece of work, because I think even just with, we got permission from the landowners, but essentially you just stand back and you're just quietly people counting, and that's kind of quite easy to do. You don't need to kind of impinge on anyone's privacy. In fact, you're supposed to not tell people what you're doing. You say, I'm doing a traffic survey, because you might change their behaviour. Not sure whether that's ethically fine, but it is quite straightforward. And then you just need lots of time to do it. Sorry, the other question, the magic wand. I'm going to let you guys do the magic wand first. I can't. It's too hard, isn't it? I should have got one magic.
It's too hard. I think flipping the hierarchy between the car and children in every way we design is what I would like to happen overnight. I think that would have the biggest impact across the UK, certainly outside London. It would transform how we think about housing and how we design housing in this country. So yeah, no discussion about the car at all.
Maybe we should let children drive.
Yeah.
I think for me, just on the niche issue point, I think that's really correct. And when I was thinking about this talk tonight, I was thinking about education actually, and how it's not present. I've been involved in, architecture, urban design, urban planning education, and you don't really see it there talked about. So I think it's a really important issue. And I think often, with developers, it's not talked about. It goes back to my point previously. It's seen as a tick box exercise. It's not ingrained in how we think about creating places. So I think my magic wand, I completely agree with you, but I think my point would actually be to get more passionate developers involved in developing our housing. I think, we need to really support the ones that are out there, whether it's community builders, SME developers, local authorities who are building houses, to really support them, because I think they can really kind of drive change and show what's possible.
Yeah, and children are not really seen as urban citizens. I mean, it is sort of remarkable that you can go through architectural education and not engage with this basic question about who will be living in housing, and sort of recognizing the needs of urban who will be living in it. If there are other questions, okay, why don't we just very quickly, you can boil your question or comment down to like one sentence. We can take the last few, and then if there's time, people can respond, or they can just hang there on the arm.
I'm doing my research for my thesis and my master in architecture. I'm doing it in exactly this sort of design. And I wanted to know how you're tackling antisocial behavior between teenagers, because I can see that you're trying to make young people be visible for adults and that, but I've seen that some adults consider teenagers just hanging around being considered as antisocial behavior. So I don't know how these sort of designs can tackle that without isolating teenagers. Yeah.
Great, okay. Just a few more questions and very quick answers. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just to maybe ask from the good side, what have you seen that are the incentives for developers, for city planners to actually make this shift? Because we talked a lot from the ones that are not on board yet, but I think there's quite a bit of good practices that maybe are the ones that can highlight, like what is the reasoning there and what has made sense to them to actually make that change.
Great, maybe just, okay. One more question and then we can have single word answers.
Hi, yes, I just wanted to go a bit deeper into what it means to have good housing for caregivers. Especially in the global south, I think women have more care responsibilities, so they use public space way more. So I just wanted to see what your thoughts are on that.
Great, we've got about a minute left.
I'll give it a, okay, try and do all of the three in one go. Okay, get teenagers in the room because it turns out that they are othered and othering people isn't very helpful. They will convince you that they want to be part of the community, they're really interested in other age groups, there's a depth to them that isn't just about antisocial behaviour. Also, they can be quite annoying. I have been a parent of a teenager for quite a long time now, and that is their job, to be quite annoying. So we need to have that conversation with them. And join, they are part of society, but they cannot be using a sentence as teenagers and antisocial behaviour because there's an element of racism within that anyway. So we need to be very careful about that kind of language, I think. Just in terms of the caregivers, I think it goes back to this political point. Just very quickly, if we think about some of our kind of suburban housing models, it's very, very anti-female. It kind of traps you at home in a kind of lifestyle that really isn't about raising children as a village. And I think we need to think about how it takes a village, and housing that allows us to think of the village and think of the benefit that has to the caregivers is so much more powerful than the kind of single unit model and the aspiration in the car. Those are very different ways of looking at housing, aren't they? And that is incredibly political, but the benefit that has to caregivers is enormous, because it does take a village, as we all know, as parents and as communities, because it shouldn't just be about the moment you become a parent. I absolutely agree. And Vicky, yes, there is so much good. There is so much good that we need to keep celebrating. And I think we also need to make sure that developers, I forgot what I was going to say, so I'm going to leave that next. But there is so much good we can be sharing with developers to kind of get them on board with the idea.
Well, we are actually out of time, so
Sorry.
I think we'll just have to leave it there, but that was a great note to end on. So I just want to thank Dinah, Joe, and Jacob, and thank all of you for coming. And yeah, I look forward to everyone designing better cities in the future.